Hi, my name is Tammy Spellbring. I am the Deputy Director for Clinical and Treatment Services at Behavioral Health Services Division under the Healthcare Authority. HCA is dedicated to making the state of New Mexico trauma-informed, beginning with ensuring our staff is trauma-informed. HCA is providing training with Dr. Bill in what trauma and informed care is that is based on SAMHSA's concept of trauma-informed approach. There is an increasing focus on the impact of trauma and how service systems may help to resolve or exacerbate trauma-related issues. These systems are beginning to revisit how they conduct their business under the framework of a trauma-informed approach. SAMHSA worked with trauma experts in research and treatment as well as trauma survivors to help craft a definition of and concepts about trauma-informed approaches that would be relevant to public health agencies and service systems. Referred to variably as trauma-informed care or trauma-informed approach, this framework is regarded as essential to the context of care. These areas include a comprehensive working definition for trauma that includes the 3 E's of trauma: the event, which is the traumatic situation, the experience, the way someone emotionally responds to the event, and the effects, both the short-term and long-term outcomes of the event. Also, the 4 R's of trauma-informed care, which include realize, recognize, respond, and resist re-traumatization. 6 guiding principles to guide us in approach and treatment that include safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. Through these trainings, HCA staff will have the information and tools to interact with others both internally and externally in a trauma-informed manner. Thank you and enjoy the training.
Hello, and welcome to New Mexico's Healthcare Authority. This webinar is a review of trauma-informed care concepts and practices for maintaining a trauma-responsive workforce. My name is Bobby Beal, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, founder of Life Adventures for All, and the co-director of the Center for Innovative Practices, Ohio's Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, located at Case Western Reserve University. I have over 30 years of experience working with youth and their families in a variety of settings, including outpatient, day treatment, home-based, residential, camp, and schools. The common factor across all clients and settings would be the high degree of exposure to trauma and traumatic stress. The purpose of this training is to ensure that your workforce recognizes and responds appropriately to people who have experienced significant trauma and stress. So, let's jump in. What is trauma-informed care? Let's take a look. Trauma-informed care involves understanding the impact of trauma on people's current functioning and recognizing the ways systems can add to people's trauma and stress. In addition, trauma-informed care provides safety, supports, and opportunities for healthy recovery. The goal of trauma-informed care is recovery. It makes sense that we need some understanding of what causes the trauma in order to effectively help. When we provide trauma-informed care, we provide safety, supports, and opportunities that will promote healthy recovery and optimal brain development throughout the lifespan. Here's our training agenda. We're going to define trauma and trauma-informed care, as we were just looking at that. We're going to have a brief review of the ACEs study. We're going to check in on your self-awareness. You should really know your own ACE score or your own ACE experiences. We're going to check out the consequences and costs of childhood trauma. We'll dive into the neurobiology of trauma and stress, how it impacts our brain and our responses. We're going to look at that scope of trauma responses that are out there. And we're going to understand that regulation precedes reasoning. You can't chat with somebody or ask them to do something unless they are feeling present and regulated. So that'll be an important part that we delve into. I'm also going to remind you that self-care, that I'm talking about you now, is trauma-informed care. And you really will have a difficult time providing trauma-informed care unless you have both self-awareness and self-care practices. And finally, we'll wrap things up with responding with empathy. But first, this is a trigger warning and some safety guidelines for you because hearing and learning about trauma can be very stressful, especially for those of us with our own significant trauma. So let's run through this. We're going to ask you to take care of yourself. We have to create and maintain safety by establishing physical and emotion safety as our primary goal in trauma-informed care. And if that's what we intend to do with and for our customers and clients, we need to understand that it starts with ourselves. We recognize that many of us have our own trauma histories. As a matter of fact, trauma exposure is generally higher than average within the human services workforce. This happens for a variety of reasons. For example, you may work here because you want to break the cycle of trauma that you personally experienced. Or you may want to help ensure that people who have experienced trauma get the help that they need and deserve. Either way, those of us with significant trauma histories may find ourselves feeling agitated, triggered, upset, or avoidant during this presentation. Pay attention to your responses. Trust your gut. Here are some suggestions. First of all, take care of yourself. How can you do that while you're watching a webinar? Well, you control the pause button, so take breaks as needed. This isn't a horribly long presentation. I expect it'll be less than 90 minutes in the end, but you might need a break every 10 to 15 minutes or a nice little rest in the middle. On the other hand, if you're coping well with the presentation and not feeling agitated or triggered, you are welcome to buzz through it until it's completely done. But do feel like you can take a break if you need to. When you take that break, you might consider hydrating. Lack of water in our system is one of the key components to re-regulating ourselves. In addition, when we spend a lot of time looking at screens like we're doing right now, we tend to get dry eyes and we do not blink enough. So I encourage everybody to blink, 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 and the occasional stretch can be beneficial. So even if you're still listening, moving your body a little bit. I happen to work at a stand up and down standing desk. And so when I get really fidgety, I can just rearrange the height of my desk and stand for a while. But you do what feels best to you. Another idea is for you to jot things down, take notes. Even if you don't ever use the notes in the future, simply writing things down in the way that you hear and understand them will help you remember and understand these concepts later. In addition, you could take advantage of the writing part of it and jot down any questions you might have. You, of course, are welcome to email me. I'm not hard to find. But I really would encourage you to talk with other people in your organization and on your team and see if they might have similar questions or concerns. And finally, above all else, be compassionate with yourself and others. And if you do need to take that break or stop the recording for some reason, just make sure that you return when you can. Do take the time to get yourself regulated and come on back in and hit play to stay informed on trauma-informed care. So let's start. This is SAMHSA's definition of trauma, which has 3 stages, dubbed the 3 E's. And you'll see why in just a moment. Individual trauma results from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is then experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And that leads to lasting or long-term adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. This framework of the 3 E's of trauma: events, experience, and effects, was developed by a working group of researchers, practitioners, trauma survivors, and family members that was convened by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration at the federal level in the United States. It's important because it creates a framework for understanding the complex nature of trauma. So let's begin by focusing on those events. One of the goals of this presentation is to review all this information for you, and if some of it feels familiar, it's on purpose. It does not hurt to review, and it really reinforces your learning and what you know and understand. So, one of the goals of this presentation is to shift people's thinking. We just learned that events are the first E of SAMHSA's explanation of trauma. Remember that events can be a single thing that happens to you, a car accident, or somebody's rude to you, or a series of events. Those might be something like living in an environment where somebody is routinely mean or rude to you, or ongoing chronic conditions like living with ongoing abuse or living in poverty. So individuals can experience trauma directly. They can witness trauma that happens to somebody else. So if you've ever been the witness of somebody being injured or being in an accident of some type, that can feel pretty overwhelming as well, even though it's not happening to your body. And finally, we can feel overwhelmed hearing about events that traumatize others. And as workers in the human services fields, that is the most common way for us to experience a lot of trauma, and it is called secondary traumatic stress. But let's go back and think about, how do we shift our thinking about these events? Because one of the reasons we're saying this is because people often want to blame people for having traumas. They want to say that you've caused it yourself somehow. And that just simply isn't the case, but I think it might help people feel better if they think they can blame someone or something. So if I can blame it on something outside of myself, then maybe it'll never happen to me, sort of thing. So let's unpack this a little bit. The focus on events places the cause of the trauma in the environment and not on some defect of the individual. So we shouldn't be blaming the person for that happening. And I want to mention that this includes getting rid of the notion that anyone could deserve trauma. No one deserves trauma. Many times people need help or seek treatment because they're dealing with their own or other people's very difficult emotions or challenging behaviors, which are actually responses to trauma, not because something is inherently wrong or flawed with that person. So when we focus on the events or the conditions that created the responses, we shift the problem to the trauma and don't fault or blame the person who is suffering. This is what underlines the basic credo of trauma-informed approaches. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. When and how did we become so aware of trauma? Well, it was the ACE study. It was originally called The Origins of Addiction and first published in the late 90s as a research study. And it was the impetus for launching literally hundreds, possibly by now thousands, of subsequent studies on trauma. Probably because it indicated that early adversity or trauma or chronic stress has horrible and lasting impacts. And this is just a colorful array of them: traumatic brain injury, mental health conditions, pregnancy complications, HIV, sexually transmitted diseases, cancers, addictions, negative impacts on learning or working. All of these are some of the long-term, long-lasting effects that may not pop up in somebody's life until years, if not decades, after their adverse childhood experiences. And let me mention real quickly here, why do we focus on childhood experiences as opposed to any kind of trauma or chronic stress? Because we all experience those things throughout our lives. We're going to lose people, we're going to have accidents, bad things happen. But why do we focus so much on children? Because their brain is still in development when it's occurring, and it literally changes how your brain is developed. We're going to dive into that a little bit later, but I felt like I should mention it now. Let's take a look at the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. The ACE study was the largest scientific research study of its kind, analyzing the relationship between the categories of adverse childhood experiences, and those are the things you see on the screen right now. Those are 10 different categories of adverse childhood experiences, and the ACE study compared how many of the categories people had experienced against their adult status on average a half century later, related to the long-term health and behavioral health outcomes in their lives. Results indicated that there were 10 common adverse experience categories grouped into 3 areas. Your 3 areas are abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Those first 2 areas, abuse and neglect, are not a big surprise, right? That's why we have child welfare departments in every state. Abuse and neglect are considered to be individualized experiences or things that happen directly to a child, versus that last area, household dysfunction, which is usually experienced as a group, whoever's in the household. And multiple people living in constant contact with each other see each other's traumas and stressful situations as well. This inclusion of household dysfunction was one of the biggest eye-openers from the ACE study. For the first time, this type of study expanded beyond just the individual. These items are not directly about the child's behavior, but the experiences of their entire family or household, reinforcing for all of us that context matters. Let's take a look at who was in the study. Over 17,000 participants filled out a survey asking about these 10 categories. And most people would agree that this was a highly privileged population. White, well-employed, and well-insured, or they wouldn't have been in the study. There are 2 points to be made here, probably 100 points, but I'm going to give you 2 points. If this privileged group had this much negative long-term health and behavioral health outcomes that I'm about to show you, how much more negative impact might it have on our clients, who probably are not quite as privileged? And secondly, trauma impacts everyone, not equally, but the more privilege we have, the more we can buffer trauma. But trauma does impact everyone. Our recent pandemic, COVID-19, helped us all understand that. So, ACEs are very common, and we weren't even looking at all the potential early traumas yet. But the original ACE findings, just a couple of high points. Of those 17,000 respondents, more than 25% grew up in a household with an alcoholic or drug user. 25% had experienced physical abuse as children. 66%, so let me think about that. Almost 7 people out of 10 had at least one adverse childhood event or category. 16%, or 1 in 6 people, had 4 or more ACEs. We're going to talk about that, and the importance of 4 or more categories really pushes you into having a lot more long-term negative impact. But before we dive into the impact of the ACEs, I have to say we didn't identify them all in that first study. What do you think might have been missing? And because this is a review, you should probably know. What things were we missing when we thought about adverse childhood experiences? Well, because of the level of privilege, the original study participants did not identify all of the most common traumas. So we're going to take a quick look at what was missing and what most researchers are now including in ongoing additional studies. First of all, there's school and community violence. Of course, we know something about this. We have probably been exposed to or heard about the bullying that happens in school, out of school, at the bus stop, online, those sorts of things. So school violence or school bullying or school adversity is a thing for a huge percentage of our students out there in the world, and possibly for some of you. In addition, uh, school violence, of course, is more talking more about children and youth. Community violence can happen to anyone, adults, children, the elderly, it doesn't matter. So muggings, rapes, burglaries, all sorts of things could happen in your community out in the world. And those two are traumatizing. Next, I want to touch on disasters and accidents. So disasters, I think of that as natural disasters, not that it feels very natural to have a bad thing happen, but we're talking about hurricanes and tornadoes and flooding and tidal waves and to some degree wildfires and other things like that. So disasters happen, and they hadn't even thought to mention those in the original ACE study, but for sure we see a lot of people struggling with that. We're having a lot with the climate change going on. There's a lot of that kind of dramatic weather that can really harm giant swaths of people. Then you have accidents, and I think of those as more human-made accidents. So we don't cause the hurricanes necessarily, although arguably climate change, we cause climate change, and that leads to those sorts of things. But more directly, we cause all sorts of accidents. We have industrial accidents and farming accidents and car and bus and truck accidents and airplane crashes. All of these things could, and I don't think anybody would argue that they feel traumatizing when those things happen to you. Another category is invasive or prolonged medical procedures. Now, this didn't make the early lists, and I have to say there was some pushback from the medical community to have any of their procedures identified as traumatizing, because they would say that all of their procedures are life-saving kinds of procedures. But the problem is, of course, they can be painful. They can be invasive. You might have to undergo treatment for a long time to get the positive benefit. And it turns out they have sort of a double whammy, those medical procedures. First of all, if you have a medical procedure that falls into one of those categories, you can feel worn out and even ill by them. A lot of cancer treatments, for instance, make people feel nauseous and sick. Secondly, if you're a kid in the household and you have a loved one going through some of these medical procedures, you are worried if they're going to make it or if you're going to get what they have. And so that's a lot of negative stuff floating around the home environment when you have somebody involved in that. So definitely brings along chronic stress, if not actual trauma. And the next category that was unattended to in the original study is discrimination and oppression. They are now recognized not only as acute or individual traumas, but also as chronic traumatic stress. To live with constant marginalization, where you don't get all of the privileges and rights as the other members of your society, ends up taking a toll on your health and well-being, the same as all the other traumas. And really, very few are exempt from this category. Women in general suffer from the patriarchy, blocked from some careers, or even if we break into those jobs, we don't make the same amount of money. And of course, we have some clearly identified cultures that suffer directly from discrimination and oppression in the United States, starting with our indigenous populations, who were identified as savages and were either slaughtered in military attacks or removed from their lands and placed in reservations to limit their existence. Then we have the forced relocation and enslavement of Africans in America, not just a crime in the US, but we were active in slavery for hundreds of years. And we should also mention the Jewish people who suffered through the Holocaust when Hitler led the charge to exterminate them during World War II. Currently, the focus on much of the aggression and oppression is, for some reason, on transgender people. All of these are examples of cultural and historical and current traumas. While we'd like to think we're several generations past some of these horrors, we now understand that the human brain doesn't let go of that history. It turns out our brains retain the stress markers that are passed along across generations in our DNA. And of course, many of us today are still living with ongoing discrimination and oppression. Finally, poverty, the ultimate chronic stress. Not only are people in poverty struggling day to day, and by the way, if there's heavy discrimination and oppression, they're likely to also have poverty to deal with. They worry about, can they feed and house their loved ones on a daily basis? And they have the double whammy of not being able to protect themselves from all the rest of the traumas. They certainly don't have the money to either buffer or recover from those acute traumas. Most current trauma research now includes these additional categories, considered related life events or chronic stressors. That takes the original 10 categories that I showed you up to more than 15. The World Health Organization issued a statement in 2020 that trauma and racism have a very direct impact on our health and behavioral health. So, even with these added categories, these are still partial lists of the traumatic events. We don't rule a trauma in and out based only on a list. There are a very wide range of events that can potentially cause trauma. So, trauma can be caused by events that the individual doesn't remember, such as events that occurred in early childhood. When you're traumatized prior to the development of language, you will never be able to talk about what happened, but you'll still have emotional and neurological responses related to those early events. Trauma can also be caused by events that are well-intentioned and necessary, like those medical procedures that I talked to you about. And trauma can be caused by an event that didn't happen directly to a person, but to a group that they identify with closely, as in slavery or the Holocaust or the genocide of the Native American people. Over time, however, chronic stressors can accumulate to cause the exact same outcomes as acute trauma. So this is a new slide, and I throw it in here because as we broaden our lens for trauma, we begin to see that there are additional layers of ACEs in our world. The tree itself in this picture represents those original 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences. The roots of the tree represent adverse community experiences. It matters where we land in the world. And last I checked, none of us got to choose who we were born to or where we ended up being born. And so we might find ourselves in a community where there's poverty, violence, poor housing quality or affordability, discrimination, lack of social capital, economic mobility, or opportunity. All of these things are adverse things that can happen in our neighborhoods, our communities, the places where we live. The dark blue layer at the bottom recognizes what they termed atrocious cultural experiences that impact entire cultural groups, like we already mentioned, slavery, colonization, and genocide. The clouds at the top of this picture foreshadow the ultimate adversity, adverse climate experiences, which may be humanity's final challenge. But back to the ACE score. Let's switch our gears from the global to the personal. I'd like to mention why self-awareness about our own trauma history is critical for good practice. Self-awareness is the ability to take an honest look at your life without attachment to it being right or wrong. You're just aware. You can reflect upon things. Self-awareness allows professionals to understand your own biases, emotions, and reactions. This can help us to be more impartial, build trust with others, and provide culturally competent services. It also enables us to engage with clients more effectively and ethically, leading to better outcomes in the long run. You should pause the recording now if you don't already know your own ACE score. And you could go to a website called acesaware.org and find the ACE questionnaire for adults. That link on the slide at the bottom in the white part does have a link, is a link directly to that quiz. So if you don't know what your score is, go find someplace to get your score. Take the quiz, know your score, reflect on what your personal history is. The more you're able to do that, the less likely you are to be triggered by a client or a customer. Back to the ACEs. We're looking at the newest CDC version of the ACE pyramid here. It demonstrates how childhood trauma influences the entire lifespan. The newest, why this is a new pyramid, the newest things that were added were the bottom two gray bars: historical trauma and generational embodiment and social conditions and local context. That's often about, these things are often about the cultural trauma that I mentioned a few slides ago, the beginning of your genetic origins. Then you're born into a specific family in a specific place, right? Your social conditions and local context. And it does make a difference what context you land in. It's why it's so expensive to live in certain neighborhoods. It's probably more protected. Context determines what challenging conditions you are going to be exposed to, as well as what sort of supports you might have access to. So we've acknowledged historical trauma and that social conditions matter. Then the dark green bar in the middle, adverse childhood experiences. Then somebody, a child in particular, has their own personal adversity. If they don't have any, or they have less than 4 categories of trauma, they're likely to do okay, and their brain will develop in a way that we consider to be normal or average, okay? But unfortunately, if they experience 4 or more categories out of that entire list of more than 15 that we've identified already, that is enough trauma or stress to disrupt their neurodevelopment. Now, that means it changes how your brain is developed and wired. And if you think about it, 4 just isn't that many. 4 categories just isn't that many. We used to think a score of 4 or more was unusual, but now I strongly believe that a score of less than 4 is the unusual thing. Many, many people have 4 or more. And I'm positive that many of the people watching this webinar have 4 or more. As we move up the pyramid, we see that disrupted neurodevelopment causes a variety of social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. Just think about it. If you're repeatedly worried about trauma, I'm going home and it's not safe there. Maybe there's a predator in the neighborhood or a bully at my bus stop or an abuser in my home. That child, that youth probably isn't able to settle their mind or body and learn typical developmental tasks or educational lessons. So they might not be good at making or keeping friends, fall behind at school, generally feel lousy much of the time, maybe even thinking that they deserve some or all of the stuff that is happening to them. This leads them to adopt these high-risk behaviors. Your brain literally compels you to do things that give you some relief, even if only for the moment. These risky behaviors lead to disease, disability, and social problems. At the top of the pyramid is early death, because how many diseases and disabilities can we have before it takes a toll on our actual lifespan? Let's keep going. We'll touch base on a couple more of those levels as we move through this. What I want you to know next is that untreated ACEs become more serious over time. This is why it's important to address things early. And here's how it works. First of all, during your childhood, you're exposed to some trauma and chronic stress, and it could impact your development. We know that it will impact your neurological development, but you could have other developmental delays, and it's going to affect how you function as a child. And one of the biggest functioning things about children is they go to school. And if they can't behave appropriately there, they could get expelled from school. And so right away, we're interrupting a child's normal, healthy development. Secondly, as adolescents, the behaviors get worse. It turns into delinquency and violence. They'll probably have some mental health disorders. They probably have early sexual activity. And they're going to dabble in drugs and alcohol, substances that numb the pain or help them not think about the chronic stress that they're in. And then by the time they enter adulthood, these little problems have become big psychiatric issues. They may be abusing drugs and alcohol on a regular basis, and some of their behaviors could be cross the line into criminal behavior. Obviously, these are only partial lists, but untreated, it's going to continue to create all sorts of problems throughout their lifetime. So, the ACE studies indicate that adverse childhood experiences are not only horrible to have to deal with, they are the most basic and long-lasting cause of many of our most difficult challenges. They cause those health risk behaviors. They cause mental illness, social malfunction, lots of diseases, many disabilities, early death, and a ton of healthcare costs. So the ACE studies link all of these childhood traumas to poor outcomes in a very strong and graded fashion. And what that means is the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to have some array of these problems that you see on your screen. Many believe that childhood trauma is the largest public health issue of our time. Let's see what they mean by those health risk behaviors. So this is the top row of this particular side. These are the behaviors that create more problems with your health, okay? First, overwhelming trauma disrupts your brain, and then your brain compels you to do risky things. Trauma does not make you want to get up and get healthy. It makes you want to stop moving and avoid people and places and just sort of close up on yourself. Okay, so this lack of physical activity is a huge marker for a big trauma history. Then in the middle here, we have all those addictions, right? Smoking, drinking, substances, all of that sort of stuff. And again, your brain's idea related to substances is just try some of these things. Something might make you feel better, even if only for a few minutes, or perhaps it'll numb you so you don't have to think about it for a while. And people, once you start those sorts of things, it's hard to turn it back around, right? And then finally, we have this missed worked category over here in the end. And this does two things for us. One, it's true. You might miss people, heavily traumatized people might miss a lot of work. Some of it goes back to this lack of physical activity and just not wanting to get out of bed and move, right? So you can't get into work on time. But others of it might just be you're having a bad day, and so you're more likely to use all your time off that you can and more. And I like being able, the second part of this is a way for you to potentially recognize that either this is you I'm describing, or you have colleagues that I'm describing. Perfectly nice people who would love to do good work, but they can't get themselves to show up on time and be where they need to be. You don't really want to interact with other people, and so you avoid it. It's very common for people with high ACE scores to call off work or miss school if they're young enough, for all of these reasons. It's not usually because they don't want a job or they don't want to make money or they don't want to learn things or they don't want to help other people. They just can't make themselves do it. There are a few other risky behaviors that didn't make this chart. Sexual behaviors. Highly traumatized people tend to either lean into lots of indiscriminate or unprotected sex or avoid sex altogether. Having an unhealthy relationship with sex either way. And another category of problem behaviors is taking risk just for the rush. Shoplifting, speeding, jumping off of high places. These are all behaviors that give us an emotional or neurological rush, boost, or high, allowing us to not think about the trauma or the stress for a moment. Truthfully, none of these behaviors are actually that helpful, but they all have to do with numbing, avoiding, or escaping ways to feel, escaping bad feelings or ways to cope with unpleasant feelings. So just remember what I said at the end of this last slide, that the higher your ACE score is or goes, the higher your risk for these problem behaviors. And all of these problem behaviors end up leading to these physical and mental health problems or diagnoses. And while these are the big hitters, obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide, STDs, heart disease, cancers, strokes, COPD, and even broken bones. These are the big hitters. There are many, many additional. We need to understand this is the money chart. Childhood trauma leads to health risk behaviors, which lead to long-term and expensive issues, which we all pay for one way or another. So trauma does impact everyone. But the younger you are, the higher the risk of negative impact due to the developing brain. So let's work our way through this slide. And remember that experiencing 4 or more categories, not individual traumas, folks, but categories of trauma, causes disrupted neurodevelopment and moves people up on that trauma pyramid where they adopt those health risk behaviors. It's worth mentioning here that we are not likely to see those negative long-term health consequences when we work with children or even young adults. Those poor physical and mental health outcomes begin showing up in middle adulthood and beyond. So you're talking about decades after awful things happen to you. That's when your body starts to not be able to just keep it under wraps. It makes it difficult for people to see these outcomes as a direct result of childhood trauma because it has such a long delay before those outcomes are seen. So another thing that we all need to understand is how triggers are developed. We may not witness their original trauma or stressor, but we're very likely to see people's triggered responses. And here's how that happens. Whatever wires together, whatever fires together, wires together. Sorry, I said that backwards at first. And what that means is when something traumatic or stressful is happening to you, other things are happening around you as well, and it all gets wired in together. When somebody is being traumatized, let's say by being mugged, for example, their 5 senses are on fire. And imagine let's walk through it. Imagine you're at a city bus stop. It's dusk. You're about 50 feet down the street from a hot dog kiosk. While the mugger comes up behind you, poking you in the back with what you assume is a gun, you still see the sunset, smell the hot dogs, feel the temperature or the moisture of the air on your skin, taste the gum in your mouth, or hear the traffic. Of course, being mugged or poked with a gun will trigger you in the future, and that's an obvious trigger. But it's all these other triggers that we don't think about necessarily that make us uneasy, dysregulated, or frightened. It's everything that all of your senses detected. So every single trauma happens in the context of your life where there are other things for you to see, smell, taste, hear, or feel. Okay, so dozens of potential triggers can haunt you, and they're created by your 5 senses. Any one of them can make you feel icky, and when anything triggers you, If it's the smell of hot dogs, for instance, triggering you, you're immediately going to overinterpret danger. You're going to feel like that smell makes me feel like I'm in danger. And when we overinterpret danger, unfortunately, we tend to overreact to situations. Let's think about that. Overreactions aren't tiny, manageable things. They tend to be quick and extreme, not in the person's conscious control because they've been triggered by your senses. I had a young client who was making microwave popcorn when his mom's boyfriend kicked in the kitchen door and beat his mother unconscious right in front of the kid who had sort of climbed back under the table. 2 years later, we had trouble figuring out why he was flipping tables and hitting his peers in his day treatment program, but only on Fun Friday when we happened to be making large batches of popcorn for the afternoon movie. Those trauma responsive behaviors are tough to deal with. They're extreme. They show up as aggressive, impulsive, and self-centered behaviors, not what anyone wants to see in their classroom or on their workforce. Many people punish behaviors that are aggressive, impulsive, or self-centered. And most traumatized people are unable to identify those triggers for us to help. My little guy was never going to say, "Hey, Bobby, the smell of popcorn makes me feel super dysregulated." He can't put it together like that. It just is a feeling that rises up in him. All of these things, being triggered, overreacting, getting into trouble, exacerbates the person's shame and feelings that something is wrong with them. Which takes us back to SAMHSA, and this time there are 4 R's of trauma-informed care. We're going to focus on the first 2 for right now, and that is realize and recognize. The ACE studies helped us to realize how prevalent trauma is, and I'd like to mention that people in the helping professions, like all of us, often have higher ACE scores than the population at large. The general thought is that we do go into the helping professions to help others and to break the cycle of trauma. So it's not anything to feel bad about, but just recognize that our numbers are even higher than the ones that I've already shared with you. So that's realizing how much trauma is around us. And part of this definition here, realizing, is there's a lot of trauma and that there are many paths for recovery. It isn't one size fit all. It isn't that everyone has to go to long-term psychotherapy. Some people recover from their trauma because they have a supportive, loving relationship, family, friends, things like that. Some people recover from trauma because they get hooked on exercise and self-care and take good care of themselves, and they're willing to reflect on what happened. So there is a do-it-yourself recovery. There is treatment recovery. There is network community recovery, all of these sorts of things. There isn't just one way. So we have to realize all of that. The second R is to recognize. Now, we know we're probably seeing lots of trauma symptoms as people are triggered by a wide range of things that are wired into their stress response system. The signs and symptoms are all around us. For every trauma event, remember there are dozens of associated triggers, which means that dozens of things could launch a trauma response or a symptom. And please note the second part of this statement is that you're going to see these signs and symptoms, yes, in your clients and customers, their family members, and also our staff and everyone involved within the system. So realize the widespread impact of trauma and recognize the signs and symptoms. I still believe, and you may remember this from one of your other trainings, that the easiest way to recognize signs and symptoms of trauma is to look for that bigger than expected response. If somebody's overreacting to something, I almost always think, I'm seeing a trauma response here. All right, we're going to circle back around later in this webinar to hit respond and resist, but we'll leave that for now. How is it that your brain works, first of all? and we'll look at typical conditions. Then how is it that trauma impacts the brain and how does it work differently? So input comes in through our senses. For example, your smartphone might light up and you can observe on the screen some cues, perhaps a name or a number. Your brain interprets that input. Is it important? Is it junk? Do you care? Whatever it is, you interpret it. You process the information and quickly skim through what options you have to respond or not respond to what you see or hear. You get to choose what you want to do and make a plan to do it. And then you get to choose how you're going to respond. Okay. And frankly, our brains are amazingly efficient. And even though it took me almost a minute to explain all those words to you, in just a second or two, you actually do it. You glance down at that phone or that screen and you make a decision about what's going to happen. So our brains are super efficient and do all of these things in literally the blink of an eye sometimes. Your brain is also designed to keep you alive, so it's constantly scanning huge amounts of data for danger. That's its one big job. What out here could kill this body that is I'm housed in? If your brain interprets the input as dangerous, it literally takes over. You have no choices about it. It reroutes your neural response using a shortcut, puts up a danger barrier here, and it gives you a new way to get out, directly to an immediate reaction. Okay, now that makes sense in an emergency. We don't call a meeting to decide if we should run from the angry animal or exit the burning building. We just go. But notice that shortcut gives you no access to the thinking, planning part of your brain, your cortex or your prefrontal cortex. Your stress response system, including your limbic system and your amygdala, hijacks the process and you end up on this express route and you have a strong and immediate reaction. No choices, no thoughtful responses when that stress response system is activated. Believe it or not, some stress can be beneficial or even positive. When we're asked to do something difficult, a little bit out of our comfort zone, like speaking in public or competing in sports or presenting something, we experience brief increases in our heart rate, mild elevation in our stress hormone levels, which actually makes us stronger. So stress can be positive. This can condition or prepare us for serious but temporary stressful situations. And that makes them more tolerable if we've had a little practice. And it's really helpful if it's also buffered by supportive relationships. So not only have I had a little practice dealing with a stressful situation, I have a helper, or I have somebody who encourages me, or I have somebody who calms me, those sorts of things. And that's all identified as tolerable stress. Tolerable stress can also be buffered by those supportive relationships. But it will get toxic. Stress will get toxic or cause damage when the stress is prolonged, unending, overwhelming, especially in the absence of those protective relationships. So I don't think all stress is bad stress. We're actually designed to deal with a certain amount of stress and without a huge negative impact. It's when things become toxic and we can't seem to escape it. And let's see what happens then. So with repeated or toxic stress, think 4 or more categories. Think of things that completely overwhelm you. Coupled with your overly sensitive interpretation, remember, hot dogs or popcorn aren't really that dangerous, but they're triggers for people. And that relates to feeling like you're in danger. That little red express route becomes the superhighway of reactivity when it's triggered repeatedly. It's like you're stuck in your stress response system, even when things aren't threatening, and you lose your ability to problem solve because you can't get to that top part of your brain. This, folks, is the disrupted neurodevelopment from the ACE study. Pyramid. Your brain is literally hardwired to respond differently than your peers with less childhood trauma or less toxic stress. That express route has now become the only route for people who have a lot of overwhelming or toxic stress. So here's a little neuroscience. We'll focus on two areas of the brain, your prefrontal cortex, which is what we think of as the smart part of your brain. It gives us the ability to have abstract thought, complex thinking, do analysis, make decisions, have willpower to do something. And the second area we'll focus on is the limbic system. This area was designed absolutely to protect us from danger without wasting resources or time. It connects directly to your sympathetic nervous system, and it governs all your involuntary and automatic things like your heartbeat, your breathing, your emotions, those sorts of things. So those are the areas that we'll focus on. So what happens involuntarily when stress happens? When that limbic system senses danger, it unleashes some brain chemicals, and they cause chain reactions known as fight or flight. Things that you can't stop, but you sure can feel them. It increases your heart rate. You start having higher blood pressure. Your muscles might clench up, and you will have strong negative emotions. And because all of that is happening, this other piece happens. Your brain CEO goes AWOL. The smart part of your brain, you lose access to it altogether, that prefrontal cortex, because it's literally not included in your fight or flight response. Your brain wants to control things. It doesn't want you to think about it or try to problem solve it. It just wants you to survive it. So how stress affects our bodies is super important, and it robs us of our ability to think and plan and problem shoot. Stress is recognized as the #1 proxy killer disease. The American Medical Association notes that stress is the basic cause of more than 60% of all human illness and disease. This slide illuminates some of the most common stress responses in our bodies: chronic fatigue and insomnia, headaches, anxiety, panic, teeth grinding, heart issues, weight gain, diminished sex drive, physical pain, addictions. And of course, these are just a few of the things. Something that activated a lot of trauma reactions was COVID-19. That pandemic lasted longer than any of us anticipated, and we need to understand that living in a pandemic that was 3 years of chronic traumatic stress. And although it impacts all of us, those with significant cultural, historical, and childhood trauma will have had much stronger reactions and experienced much more difficulties with that added chronic stress. That chronic stress activates our stress response system, which kicks in our survival skills. And you know these skills as fight, flight, and freeze. And if that's true, if I've got this science right, and I believe I do, what's wrong with that? Survival skills are supposed to save our lives. And for the most part, that's what they try to do. Why would we interrupt that? Why do we look at that as a problem? Well, if it keeps us locked in that stress range, it's destroying our healthy systems in service to making us survive a moment. Okay. So let's see what else we have to say about this. Essentially, the problem is that strong negative emotions from sensing danger, real or not, activates your survival mode, including that superhighway of reactivity, which is part of our limbic system. Again, great for outrunning the saber-toothed tiger, but it shuts down our prefrontal cortex, the learning and thinking part of our brain. So we can't reflect on things or take a broader perspective or be able to consider others and what they might be thinking or feeling. And unfortunately, it's an either or situation. We simply can't use both parts of our brain at the same time. So we're not going to get to that learning, thinking brain when our survival mode is activated. And now more than ever, we have to be trauma informed. So we need to remember that activating that stress response system is hotwired to our survival skills, and our survival skills are trauma responses, all of which are intended to help us escape or deter perceived threats, alleviate pain or distress caused by a perceived or inescapable threat. Lots of people think they understand these trauma responses, at least theoretically, as fight, flight, and freeze. But trauma responses actually look like aggression, impulsivity, and self-centeredness. And everyone struggles with judging and punishing when they see these behaviors in real life. When somebody's impulsive and cuts you off in traffic, you are not kindly thinking that poor person probably has a little childhood trauma. No, you're thinking I'm going to run them off the road, or I can't believe that jerk did that. Everybody struggles with judgments and punishments when they see these behaviors in real life, whether it's in a classroom, at work, in somebody's house, or on the road. Some will claim the behavior that they see isn't really a trauma response, it's just bad behavior. And sometimes trauma responses are bad behavior, or even worse, that it's intentional bad behavior and they believe the person's doing it on purpose when it's really your brain or their brain is compelling them to do something to survive. So let's take a moment and consider some actual behaviors behind these words. For example, aggression has a lot of levels, from chronic irritation, having a short fuse and arguing at the low end of things, to threatening, screaming, and physical attacks on the high end. Impulsivity can look like not waiting your turn, snatching things, snatching things from other people. I don't know why that jumped like that, but I'll try not to get triggered by it. Impulsivity is where we were. Running away, interrupting others. I wonder if it was an impulsive click that gave me that problem. Impulsivity can be very hard to deal with in real life, especially if it's interrupting what you want to do or say. It can feel very personal and intentional, but it's a legitimate trauma response. Self-centeredness is the third category, and it might look like you don't care about others, or even it might look like buying excessive amounts of toilet paper. Remember that weird part of the pandemic? So think about what trauma responses look like up close and personal. And remember that survival skills are things that every reasonable person would act in that way in order to escape a threat or alleviate pain. And we have to stop punishing trauma responses and survival skills. When we punish these responses that could seemingly deserve some sort of behavior punishment, but when we do it, we're not helping. We're not helping at all. We're actually contributing to that person's trauma by punishing their survival skills. Does that mean we should just let them get away with all that bad behavior? Probably not. We don't want them to hurt other people or themselves. So let's dig deeper. Back to the ACE pyramid. This time, we're going to dig into how those impairments impact a person. So, first of all, it causes the person's alarm system to no longer function as it should, right? It's going off when they smell popcorn, not necessarily going off when somebody's, waving a gun in their face. So you might be getting alarms, but maybe you aren't getting alarms about actually dangerous things. It messes with your whole alarm system. Next, it creates emotional and physical responses to stress. They might be big responses or small things that just wear you down. It uses your psychological energy, which means you don't have that energy to focus on something that you want to or need to. If you're experiencing trauma in your home with your parent or caregiver, or with people who are supposed to be on your side, it can be very, very difficult to figure out if there's anyone out there that you can trust. It diminishes your capacity to trust. If you're worried about what's going to happen to you in terms of trauma, you're missing what you're supposed to pay attention to. So think about the child or the student who is worried about an abuser at home. Do you think they're doing well at spelling and multiplication tables and those sorts of things? It might also interfere their learning how to build relationships, how to care for self and others, and loads of academic lessons. These problems and gaps are often the reason that people seek help for or bring their children in for treatment. Again, not for the underlying trauma history, but for the responses or triggered responses. They aren't doing as well as they could be across their life domains. Things feel wrong and they aren't working out well, so they might seek help, but again, not about the trauma, but about those overreactions and risky behaviors that we're going to talk about next. So, a relationship has been shown between the degree of trauma and the likelihood of acquiring unhealthy lifestyle habits, including smoking, alcohol, and illicit drug abuse. But why do people take these risks and add to their own problems? Well, Dr. Folletti asked the same question of his colleagues at their research meetings, and one of the interns said, maybe these aren't new problems, but solutions to their old problems. And he was right. Your brain compels you to do things to solve the problem of being distressed, miserable, lonely, scared, tired. Folks, nobody is an addict on purpose. What they're trying to do is numb themselves or feel some distance between the trauma and their current thoughts. People do not become addicts or do these negative behaviors on purpose. They do them because it feels like an escape. Here are some of the consequences of having a lot of ACEs. So in all cases, we're comparing to people who don't have ACEs. A 0 or a 1 is like a flatline score, and they do not have nearly as frequently do not have these problems. If you have 4 or more ACEs, you are twice as likely to smoke. You are twice as likely to have a cancer or a heart disease. You are 6 times as likely to have had sex before age 15, 7 times as likely to be an alcoholic, 12 times more likely to have attempted suicide. And men with 6 or more ACEs were 46 times more likely to use injectable drugs than men with no history of adverse childhood experiences. And I'm just touching on a few of the highlights. Okay, there are lots of other negative, just as negative consequences. But I want you to understand that it really peaks when we hit that tipping point of 4 or more. So, high levels of stress hormones caused by trauma and chronic stress can weaken the immune system. So when the saber-toothed tiger chases us, we get a rush of stress hormones because they help us to run faster, jump higher, and escape that threat. But if it's constantly getting flicked on, or it's stuck on or activated, it can actually weaken our immune system, leaving us vulnerable to infection and chronic health problems. Trauma contributes to an individual's overall well-being and could play a significant role in the severity of these problem areas. Primary medical care may be the first and only door through which individuals seek assistance. They might never knock on the door of the therapist and say, I think I'm going to work on these things. They might just wait until these illnesses and physical conditions overtake them. And physical injuries are among the most prevalent individual traumas. Most trauma patients in emergency room visits are relatively young. About 70% of injury-related emergency room visits are with people under the age of 45. And now we've worked our way all the way up to the top of the ACE pyramid. And here's what we know. People with 6 or more ACEs, so if you have 4 or more ACEs, it disrupts your neurodevelopment and you deal with these things in the upper half of the pyramid. If you have 6 or more ACEs, you're unfortunately going to hit the peak of this pyramid. And if you do, you are likely to die 20 years earlier on average than those without significant ACEs. Okay. A study appearing in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine suggested that the 5 leading causes of death in people with higher ACE scores, so 6 or higher, include heart disease and stroke, cancers, diseases of the nervous system, respiratory system, and digestive systems. These are internal, serious health issues directly related to the ACEs. And I want to say one more thing here before I leave this slide, and that is I'm giving you the scenario of people who never address the ACEs. If you have 4 or more, or 6 or more, because you are aware of your own ACE score, good for you for becoming aware, because there are lots of preventative things that you can do to change the outcome of this pyramid. This is generally about people who do not take care of it, do not do something to help themselves be healthier and to heal from that trauma. Well, that was a lot of information to work through, and you'll be happy to know we're way more than halfway through this presentation. So with very poor outcomes that we had to deal with, let's take a moment to check in with ourselves, because we had to hear a lot of bad things, and nobody gets through unscathed. Traumatized people do show up for social services work in higher numbers. So let's think for a minute about self-awareness and self-care, both requirements for successful work with highly traumatized populations. So before we take another look at SAMHSA's 3 E's, let's take a moment to focus on ourselves. How are you feeling right now? Do a quick scan of your body. Are you tense because you had to listen to all this awful stuff for the last hour? Are you breathing too shallow? Let's take a few deep breaths together. And remember, blink your eyes a lot because you've been staring at a screen. But let's try a breath. Let's take a long, deep breath in and hold it just for a few seconds. Then release it very slowly, blowing out through your lips as if you were blowing through a straw, long and slow. Then let's take another breath, possibly even deeper. Hold it. Hold it. Now release it again, slowly through that imaginary straw. And let's do one more time. Holding and releasing. That breathing pattern that we just did together activates your parasympathetic nervous system. I've been teaching you all the things that trigger your emergency system, and now I want to teach you how to trigger the system that helps you relax and feel okay. It can be very stressful to go over all of this trauma, especially for people who have their own internalized trauma or historical trauma. So make sure you take care of yourself as you do this work. Back to SAMHSA. The focus on events helped us to place the trauma in the environment and not in some defect of the individual. This underlies that basic credo. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. The focus on experience highlights the fact that not every child or adult will experience the same events as traumatic. Next, we're going to look at some of the factors that influence our experience of trauma. So, the individual's experience of trauma may be profoundly affected by when, how, where, and how often trauma or crisis or stress occurs. Dosage does matter. Even though I've been teaching you that the ACE score is derived from all the categories, it does matter if you've had any one of those categories happen again and again and again and again. Most individuals served in the public system have complex trauma, which comes from experiencing multiple sources of trauma over their lifetime. Trauma can be totally unintentional, as when an organization does harm through its procedures. For example, the routine practice of having to undress for a medical exam, who might be a stranger, the person might be a stranger to you. Systems can also unintentionally replicate the dynamics of an earlier trauma causing re-traumatization. They can boss you around. They can demand things of you. Trauma can also occur from hearing about, watching, or interacting with others who have had traumatic experiences. The accumulation of multiple categories of trauma has more negative impact on an individual functioning than any singular trauma, regardless of intensity or repetition. But circumstances and doses do matter. So circumstances that can increase the impact of a trauma include the context, expectation, and meaning. For example, being molested by a parent in your own bedroom has a way bigger impact than by a stranger away from home because it's violating our social structures and expectations. Another circumstance that increases the impact is having a threat to your life, bodily integrity, or sanity. And this can be, and frequently with children, it can be that they threaten somebody that the child loves or needs to survive. Feeling like you were going to die or feeling like you were going to lose your mind because you couldn't make it stop also has a big negative impact. The practices, policies, and procedures. What is the standard for your facility? Are they shared? Is there an awareness, for instance? Are they trauma informed? Do you have any invasive admission procedures? Do you have to do any body exams or searches? Do you use seclusion or restraint? Do you limit anyone's personal freedom? Humiliation, betrayal, and silencing. Not being believed by your parents or by others in power and authority. Not being, having the staff discount you. A client's trust might be violated because a staff member told other staff members and it got back to them. An example would be breaking confidentiality, ignoring a client or patient concern, not allowing a client or a customer to express or identify their own needs. And the last one is subconscious or unrecognized trauma. Demands or events that happen on a regular basis that aren't sensitive to individuals who have experienced trauma. For example, repeatedly having to tell your story and talk and re-talk about, teach yet some other worker what happened to you as a child or a young adult. Not taking the client's concerns seriously, proceeding with business as usual, insufficient supports to meet the client's needs, especially if you demand vulnerability by getting them to express their needs. These all increase the negative impact of the trauma. But despite that, why is it that some traumatic experiences are different for different individuals? How can the same event be traumatic for one person and not for another? Many people who experience a traumatic event will go on with their lives without any lasting negative effects, and yet others will have much more difficulty and experience lots of traumatic stress. Circumstances may enhance the risk or help somebody be resilient. The responses of the person around you can really influence your perception as well. So for instance, let's consider a youth who's molested by a trusted adult, somebody that the family really knew and thought that they trusted. If the youth tells the parent or caregiver, how they respond will strongly influence the impact. For instance, if the parent or caregiver doesn't believe them and says, I don't believe you. I don't think George would ever do that to you. That is going to have a really strong negative impact on how you deal with that stress or trauma. What if the parent or caregiver loses control? Instead, they do believe you, and it makes them tip over the edge emotionally, and they talk about wanting to go kill that person or cries uncontrollably about the youth's pain and their experience. The youth might feel damaged beyond repair and concerned that they caused or voluntarily participated in it, and now they've made their parent or caregiver upset too. On the other hand, what would be a good response? It would be the parent or the caregiver calmly expressing belief in the youth's story, assuring them that it wasn't their fault, and taking steps to connect them to a counselor or some sort of treatment or support where they could discuss it fully and develop plans to keep them safe in the future. That youth may feel very differently. They may feel like, yeah, it was a difficult, painful, or ugly thing, but something that they can and will recover fully from. A few other key points about why trauma responses might be different for some people. Some people might see it as a big trauma. Some people might see it as not a trauma at all. The other point I want to make here is resiliency buffers trauma. So trauma isn't the only thing that matters, although it's heavily the thing we focus on when we do trauma-informed care trainings. But resiliency or protective factors buffer people from trauma. And everyone has both risk and protective factors. If you personally have a lot of protective factors, like you have external support from family or friends, or you live in a safe neighborhood, or you have a great school and you've had a positive education, these are all positive or promotive factors that buffer the impact of trauma, allowing fewer negative impacts. So the trauma alone doesn't determine everything. Also, having trauma validated can be helpful. So showing empathy and support to traumatized people. But definitely, we want to remember that the person who experienced the trauma is the only one who can say how it's impacting them. We aren't allowed to say, that wasn't that bad. So one more time, we're going to drop in on SAMHSA's 3 E's. We focus on the events, which makes sure that we're not blaming the person, that we're saying trauma happens to people. We understand that people experience traumas differently. And some might perceive it as really harmful or life-threatening, and others might perceive it as a bump in the road. And that really, that takes us to the last E, which is effects. The identification of a broad range of potential effects reminds us that our response has to be holistic. Trauma doesn't just affect our physical body or our emotions or just our brain. It impacts everything. And so we can't just focus on a symptom or a behavior. Our goal is to support the people who have experienced trauma so that they can grow into a healthy adult and live a satisfying life. And if we're dealing with adults, we want to give them the opportunity to acknowledge the traumas that have happened, how has it impacted them, and what kind of adverse consequences have they experienced. So here is some of the scope of trauma effects. All trauma includes emotional, behavioral, and neurobiological responses, and the effect of trauma can be conceptualized as a normal response to an abnormal situation. Too often responses to trauma are described as abnormal, but it's really a normal response to a traumatic event. And we need to look for and understand the meaning behind the behaviors that our clients and customers are showing us. So let's click through this list. Trauma can have both short and long-term effects. So you could have, I was in a car accident years and years ago, and a short-term effect was that when I was in a car for about a year afterwards, anytime I was in a car and a car was driving towards us, I would flinch. That has long since faded away after after an accident that I had been in. And so it's not a long-term effect, it was a short-term effect, but you can imagine it would be hard to drive if you were constantly flinching from all the traffic. Trauma can also disrupt your current coping responses. It can also erode your relationships because people get really impatient with people who are behaving in those ways that we talked about. And so it could be difficult for you to engage in relationships in a positive way, or you may feel like you don't want to be around people. People may feel like they don't want to be around you, and you could find that your social network shrinks. And that's bad news because that's one of those protective factors, broad, healthy social network. It can also create developmental gaps because it interferes with mastery of developmental tasks. You're too busy being traumatized to learn the new skills. Trauma can also affect your physiological responses like a racing heart or sweaty palms, those sorts of things. And it robs you of your sense of well-being and thinking that you're healthy or doing well. And finally, it can challenge even your spiritual beliefs. And I think the phrase I want to use here is, how can God allow this to happen? Why would God allow these negative, traumatizing things to happen? And it can be hard to reconcile that with your version of a loving God. Some of these things can really amplify the effects of the trauma, and here are those specific things. First of all, the younger the age when trauma occurs, the more likely the negative consequences. And of course, the younger you are, the less likely you are going to be able to tell somebody about it. This is a very complicated time to have trauma interfere with our development, and we discussed why this is true already. Brain development, which has its most profound growth from birth through age 4, even when the individual has no memory of the trauma affects the brain or their neurobiology. Next, blaming and shaming. Shame and humiliation are core features of the trauma experience for many people. These emotions can be devastating and impede their healing. One of the most important messages that you can give a trauma survivor is that no matter what happened, it wasn't their fault in any way. Sometimes trauma survivors are intimidated by their perpetrators not to tell what happened. Other times, when they do try to talk about what happened, they are ignored or disbelieved. Another one of the most important things you can do for a trauma survivor is to give them a chance to tell their story. Healing starts when a person's personal experience is heard and validated. As an example of this, bullies often threaten their victims. If you tell, I'll hurt you or somebody that you love. The victim is afraid to talk about it, or maybe doesn't want to talk about it because they feel weak or like they somehow deserved it. And finally, the impact of trauma is magnified when the perpetrator is a trusted figure, a relative, a religious leader, a coach, a teacher, a therapist. This kind of trauma is often called betrayal trauma because the sense of betrayal can be so profound. It can feel like you're never going to trust anybody ever again. It's a violation of our social contract. Your parents should love and protect you always. So many people have agreed that we need to shift our thinking, and to do that, we need a trauma lens. Meaning all behavior has meaning beyond just that bad or dysregulated behavior, okay? And so think about and try to interpret the behavior you're seeing, and remember, if it seems out of context or overreactive, you might be seeing a trauma behavior in front of you, a trauma response. Symptoms are adaptations or survival skills. So that's a worthy thing, right? We want to survive. They're things that any normal person would do to try to escape or alleviate that pain. We want to build on success, not deficits, problems, or symptoms. So we need, instead of only seeing the person's deficits, problems, and symptoms, we have to really look hard for strengths and interests and positive things in their life. Focusing exclusively on the problem doesn't offer very many solutions. In addition, you will become a trauma trigger for that person if that's all you want to talk about with them. So remember, prevention is far more impactful than rescue. We want to work upstream on trauma. Once we figured out that people were killed in car crashes because they often flew out of the windows, we added and later required seatbelts. We didn't want to just get better at patching up broken bodies. We wanted to keep bodies from being broken in the first place. And if we could think about trauma that way and prevent it with our youngest population, we would be on the right track. So remember, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. Now that we've realized how much trauma is out there, and we've used our trauma lens to recognize the symptoms and how they look in real life, it's time to move on to the other 2 R's in SAMHSA's 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Respond and resist. So, responding. You have to fully integrate all of your knowledge about trauma into your policies, procedures, and practices. To some degree, that's the responsibility of your employer or the system in which you work. And honestly, they're trying. They're getting you lots of trauma-informed care, training, and exposure, but you have to do something with it. You have to remember it when people are triggering you. You have to remember to use your new knowledge and your new practices when people are not pleasant or happy to see you. And how do we do that? Well, we do have to, I want you to think about behaviors, somebody that you've worked with, even a colleague that you've worked with, when they've had some sort of negative or problematic behavior, can you put it in a frame now of trauma and say, that's too bad that they have to respond that way. And I'm going to get through it with them, and we're going to think about how we can respond differently. And I'm going to tell you one catch for responding differently is safety first. Can you help them to feel safer? Whatever it is. And it might just be in their head that they're not feeling safe, but can you help them find a place in their head where they feel safer? So respond differently. Don't respond with judgment and punishment, but respond in the new ways because now you know better. And then finally, can you resist re-traumatization? Once you know what their triggers are, you can't unknow that. And so we have to, you might not want to accommodate to everybody's triggers, but it's really, you really need to if you understand them. And when you see people overreacting to things, remove those things and see if you can help them identify what is triggering for them. So think differently about re-traumatization now that you understand all those triggers. You won't be able to respond with empathy unless you have some self-awareness and understand that regulation or feeling okay in your own body precedes reasoning. And we're not just talking about the clients or the customers. If you've been triggered by something that they've said or done, you're at risk for dysregulation too. And in that state, without access to your prefrontal cortex, you won't be able to help others. You have to start with yourself. The good news is that whatever would help our clients would also help us. This is a very busy slide that starts with being self-aware. What zone are you in? No matter where you start. If you're in the green, calm and happy zone, or if you're in the I'm a little down zone, I'm sad or tired, or the slow zone, you're kind of ramping up towards something, you're getting frustrated or upset or feeling hyper, or the stop zone where you're actually losing control, being angry, yelling, hitting others, those sorts of things. You have to know where you start, because that's where you must get to the green zone if you want to connect positively with your clients, customers, and coworkers. And no single strategy works for everyone. So the little tiny boxes at the bottom of this slide are 18 different ways to start heading back to the green zone. They're all experiential activities, things that you can do that usually help you feel regulated and help you get into that green zone. Drink water, count to 10, take deep breaths, tense and release your muscles, do wall push-ups or floor push-ups, use fidget toys, draw something, write something, talk to another adult, ask to take a break, talk to yourself, ask to take a walk, do breathing exercises, do stretching, listen to some music, lift something really heavy, have a snack, think about something that calms you. Okay? These aren't the only things that you can do, but it's a great list to get you started. The other thing is self-care. Intentional, constant self-care and self-compassion. Folks, this is related to that old saying about needing to put on your own oxygen mask first, then you can help others. The more we care for ourselves, the more we're available for others, and the more we actually can care about them. So self-care is not a luxury or a weakness. It's a requirement for our own health outcomes, and it's a gift to the world because you are serving others. And if that sounds a little dramatic, let me remind you, there's a lot of trauma in the world, and it ends in a lot of really bad consequences. So let's go through these quickly. First of all, we all need enough sleep. Our human bodies require sleep. So turn your screens off, avoid social media, wind down, and try to regularly get 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Nothing protects and strengthens the brain like sleep. Next, move your body. We think we stop moving because our body aches, but really, our bodies ache because we have stopped moving. Do whatever kind of movement you like. It can be super active, it can be kind of passive, but stretch. Try yoga, do a workout, take a daily walk, get a pet and have to walk them, those sorts of things. Next on the list is to eat healthier. So don't be too hard on yourselves. A lot of us have added belly weight, and as we age and mature, that seems to happen pretty effortlessly. Shame and blame do not help anyone, so relax about the sweets and the fats and focus on what you should add to a healthy diet, not what you should give up. When you do that, you're letting your brain work against you. Instead, add a couple of healthier things into your menu. Could you have a fruit or vegetable snack in the afternoon instead of a Snickers bar? That might be enough to just eat a little bit healthier. Another way to practice self-care is to practice mindfulness. Mindfulness can be done in a lot of ways. You do not have to sit in a cross-legged position and say Om. You can do meditation if that's what you like. You can also pray. You can also journal. You could also just be reflective. There's a lot of ways to practice mindfulness. It's really like just taking that cognitive and emotional break and being self-reflective. How do I feel? What am I thinking about? How's my body? Those sorts of things. There are lots of guided meditations and prayers out there. Search for them and find one that fits for you if you'd like to be guided. Next, protect your mental health. You need to do things that will help you stay strong and healthy. And that includes having a network of people to be around and do all the things on this list, get enough sleep, eat healthy, exercise a little bit, those sorts of things. By protecting your mental health, you are increasing your resiliency and protective factors, and you're going to be around to do what you want to do for longer. And finally, those healthy relationships. You deserve to love and be loved. If you have unhealthy relationships, work on either fixing them or getting away from them. and be the healthy relationship role model for the other people in your world and your life. So once you've taken care of yourself, you'll then be ready to provide trauma-informed care for others. And this is how we respond with empathy. First of all, we want to identify safety. Do you feel safe? How can I help you feel safe? What does safety look like and feel like to you? And help them find it or provide it. This may sound simple, but it needs to be highlighted because without felt safety and security, no progress or meaningful relationship will occur. Stick to the fundamental question of what happened to you. Avoid blaming. No one deserves trauma. Remember that symptoms manifest from trauma events, fears, physical issues, chronic pain, illness. These are all just adaptations from the trauma, the original stress and trauma. And healing happens in relationships, including the relationship that you are developing with your clients and customers. Remember to respond with empathy. If necessary, you could try little mental tricks, like imagine that the person that you're working with is somebody you just would love and protect to your dying breath, and not the person who's just irritating to you because they were 20 minutes late for your appointment. So do a little mental gymnastics there and make sure you're seeing people as the worthy human, possibly child, who deserves support and your best at every moment. So putting it all together, as you continue your trauma-informed care work, understand the importance of establishing a relationship through meaningful engagement. Supporting the individual as they begin to share is extremely important. Remember to ask what happened to you. Then support your survivor with 4 different kinds of statements, whichever fit for you in that moment. Number 1, I believe you. Number 2, thank you for trusting me enough to tell me about that. I'm sorry that it happened to you. And I support you. Whatever you choose to do, I'm going to be in your corner. Demonstrating that you care, you're listening, you empathize, and you are there to assist them in their journey. I want to thank you for your attention today and for being trauma informed. It's going to help us all everywhere. Have a great day.